Pack your things. Security will escort you out in 10 minutes. That's how 22 years at Pinnacle Technologies ended for me. 22 years of 60-hour weeks, missed family dinners, and building their entire IT infrastructure from scratch. And Brad Hoffman, the CEO I'd helped make millions, couldn't even look me in the eye when he said it. I'm Mike Reynolds, 48 years old, and I thought I knew how corporate America worked. Turns out, I didn't know anything. The meeting happened on a Tuesday morning in March. I'd been called to the conference room under the pretense of discussing the quarterly budget. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting that familiar corporate pallor over everything. Instead of budget spreadsheets, I walked into an ambush. Brad sat at the head of the table with Patricia O'Brien from HR, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked like she'd rather be anywhere else on earth. The termination letter was already printed, crisp and official on Pinnacle letterhead. The severance package was calculated down to the penny. Security was waiting outside. I could see their shadows through the frosted glass door. Restructuring, Brad said, his voice flat and rehearsed. That was his explanation. 22 years reduced to one word, no eye contact, no acknowledgement of what I'd built for this company. Just restructuring. What restructuring? I asked. The IT budget's been approved. We're in the middle of 3 major projects. The cloud migration alone. The decision's been made, Mike. Patricia finally spoke, sliding a manila folder across the polished table. Everything's explained in your severance package. You have 10 minutes to collect your personal items. They gave me a cardboard box, the kind you get at office supply stores, cheap and flimsy. I walked to my corner office on autopilot, my mind racing but my body moving through the motions. The Pinnacle Technologies coffee mug my daughter gave me for Father's Day went into the box first. Then the photo of my wife Sarah and the kids at last year's company picnic, all of us grinning in front of the Pinnacle banner. The engineering award I'd won for designing their cloud migration system that saved them $3 million annually. That felt heavier than it should have as I placed it carefully in the box. My hands were steady, but inside I was reeling. Around me, my team kept working, most of them not even aware what was happening. Jenny from Database Administration glanced up and gave me a puzzled look when she saw the box, but I just nodded and kept packing. No point in making this harder than it already was. Security appeared at my door. 2 guys in ill-fitting suits who probably made half what I did. They were polite but firm, watching every move as I cleared out 22 years of my professional life. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd designed the very security protocols they were following, the badge systems that were about to lock me out forever. The walk to the parking garage felt eternal, through the main floor where I'd spent countless late nights troubleshooting server crashes, past the conference room where I'd presented dozens of IT strategies to the board, down the hallway lined with photos of company milestones, many of which I'd personally enabled through my technical work. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, staring at the building I'd helped wire from the ground up. Every fiber optic cable, every network switch, every backup system, I knew where it all was because I'd put most of it there myself. The building's bones were my work, and now I was being expelled from it like some kind of virus. That evening, I broke the news to Sarah over dinner. The kids were upstairs doing homework. Our son Jake finishing his junior year at Northwestern, our daughter Emma applying to colleges. Sarah listened without interrupting, her fork hovering over her salad as I explained what happened. Restructuring, she repeated when I finished. After 22 years, that's all they said? That's all they said. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. We'll figure this out, Mike. We always do. But I could see the worry creeping into her eyes. We had 15 years left on the mortgage. Jake's tuition was $55,000 a year. Emma would be starting college in the fall, and she had her heart set on Boston University. My Pinnacle salary had been $145,000 plus bonuses. Not exactly easy to replace at 48 years old in a youth-obsessed industry. The first week I did everything you're supposed to do when you get laid off. Updated my LinkedIn profile with some corporate speak about exploring new opportunities. Reached out to my professional network with carefully worded messages about being available for new challenges. Applied to every senior IT position I could find in the Chicago area. But every phone screening came back to the same uncomfortable question. Why did you leave Pinnacle after so long? Nobody wants to hire someone who got mysteriously fired after 2 decades of service. The market assumes there's something wrong with you, some character flaw or performance issue that companies don't want to talk about. Meanwhile, I was burning through our savings. Cobra health insurance alone was costing us $1,800 a month. The severance package would last 6 months if we were careful, maybe 8 if we cut back on everything non-essential. At 48, I wasn't exactly in prime hiring territory, especially in tech where companies prefer workers young enough to pull all-nighters without complaining about their backs. That's when James Walsh called me with news that changed everything. Jim had been on my networking team for 12 years before moving to systems administration. We'd worked together on countless projects, pulled plenty of late nights fixing critical infrastructure. He was one of the few people at Pinnacle I genuinely trusted. "Mike, I heard something you need to know," he said over the phone. His voice had that careful tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news. "It's about your replacement." "What about him?" "It's Brad's nephew. Kid named Tommy Hoffman, 24 years old, straight out of college. Computer science degree from DePaul, 0 real-world experience. They're paying him $75,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. $75,000, half of what I'd been making, for a job that required 2 decades of experience and institutional knowledge that couldn't be taught in any classroom. "Jim, are you absolutely sure about this?" "Positive." He started Monday, spent his first day asking where the server room was. I hung up and sat in my home office, staring at the wall where my Pinnacle certificates used to hang before I moved them to storage. It wasn't about restructuring. It wasn't about budget cuts or corporate efficiency. Brad Hoffman had wanted to give his nephew a job and I was in the way. Simple as that. 22 years of loyalty, expertise, and dedication, tossed aside so Brad could play family nepotism with a kid who didn't even know where the servers were located. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to roll over and accept this. I wasn't going to quietly fade away while Brad Hoffman rewrote history and my family suffered for his nepotism. I was going to make them pay, but not in some dramatic emotional outburst that would land me in jail. I'm an engineer. I solve problems methodically, and Pinnacle Technologies had just become the biggest problem of my career. Sarah found me in my home office at 2 a.m., hunched over my laptop with a legal pad covered in notes. She stood in the doorway wearing her old Northwestern sweatshirt, hair pulled back, looking concerned. "Mike, what are you doing? You need to sleep." "I'm working," I said, not looking up from the screen. Pinnacle just made a very expensive mistake. She walked over and saw what I was researching. Corporate governance documents, SEC filings, shareholder rights. "Honey, please don't do anything that could hurt us legally. We can't afford—" "This is all legal," I interrupted, finally meeting her eyes. "More than legal. It's exactly how the system is supposed to work when companies screw over their employees." I spent the next 2 weeks diving deep into Pinnacle's corporate structure. As a publicly traded company, their board meetings were documented, their financial statements were public record, and their corporate bylaws were available to anyone who knew where to look. After 22 years there, I knew exactly where to look, and more importantly, what to look for. The board of directors met quarterly, 7 members total, including Brad as CEO. The chairman was Thomas Caldwell, a 67-year-old veteran who'd built and sold 2 tech companies before joining Pinnacle's board 3 years ago. He'd been brought in to provide what the business press called adult supervision after Pinnacle's stock price took a 25% hit from some questionable acquisitions Brad had pushed through. I'd met Caldwell several times at company events, holiday parties, quarterly all-hands meetings, the annual shareholder gathering. He struck me as old-school corporate, the kind of executive who believed in treating employees with respect and building sustainable businesses rather than just maximizing quarterly numbers. The kind of guy who probably wouldn't appreciate learning that his CEO was firing loyal, experienced employees to make room for unqualified family members. But moral outrage alone wouldn't be enough. I needed leverage, and that's where my 22 years of institutional knowledge became invaluable. When you're the senior IT director at a company, you don't just maintain the servers and fix network problems. You become the institutional memory, the guy who knows where all the digital bodies are buried. Email migrations, backup procedures, audit trails, compliance documentation. I'd overseen all of it. More importantly, I still had access to some legacy systems that HR hadn't thought to revoke when they walked me out. These weren't current operational systems. I'm not stupid enough to attempt anything that could be construed as hacking or corporate espionage. But archived data, historical records, old email backups that had been migrated multiple times, that was fair game, especially since some of those systems still had my administrative credentials active. What I found in those archives was a goldmine of questionable decisions and ethically gray practices. Pinnacle had been playing creative accounting games for years, nothing outright fraudulent, but definitely aggressive revenue recognition that pushed the boundaries of acceptable practice. Consulting fees paid to shell companies that seemed to exist only on paper, expense categorizations that didn't quite make sense when you looked at them closely. More damaging was the pattern I discovered in HR records. This wasn't the first time Brad had pushed out experienced employees to make room for friends and family. Over the past 3 years, he'd systematically replaced senior staff with younger, cheaper alternatives. The age discrimination lawsuit practically wrote itself, if I wanted to go that route. But lawsuits take years, cost fortunes, and you're never guaranteed to win. I wanted something more immediate and infinitely more devastating. I wanted their board seat. Pinnacle's corporate bylaws had an interesting provision that most shareholders never bothered to read. Any individual or entity owning at least 2% of outstanding stock could nominate candidates for the board of directors. Those nominations had to be taken seriously and put to a shareholder vote at the annual meeting. I didn't own 2% of Pinnacle. My employee stock options had never amounted to more than a few hundred shares, but I knew someone who did, and that's where my years of industry networking finally paid off. Heritage Investment Partners was a mid-sized fund specializing in technology companies. Their portfolio manager, Andrew Morrison, was someone I'd met at various industry conferences over the years. We'd kept in touch through LinkedIn, the occasional email about market trends, and brief conversations at trade shows. Andrew was smart, practical, and most importantly, Heritage owned approximately 4.2% of Pinnacle's outstanding shares. I called Andrew on a Thursday morning and suggested we grab coffee. We met at a Starbucks near Heritage's downtown office, sitting at a corner table away from the morning rush crowd. Andrew was younger than me, maybe 38, but he'd been managing tech investments long enough to understand operational realities that pure financial analysts often missed. "I have a proposition for you," I said after we'd exchanged pleasantries about the market and mutual acquaintances. "It's about Pinnacle Technologies." Andrew's expression shifted to professional interest. I was wondering when someone would call us about that situation. Their operational metrics have been declining for 2 years running. I laid out everything I'd discovered, the questionable accounting practices, the systematic age discrimination, the nepotism, and most importantly, the technical incompetence that was developing throughout their IT infrastructure. "They're cutting costs in all the wrong places," I explained. "Their entire IT department is being run by a 24-year-old kid who got the job because he's the CEO's nephew. Meanwhile, they're losing experienced engineers who understood their legacy systems. When something major breaks, and it will, they're going to be completely dead in the water." Andrew listened carefully, taking notes on his phone. Heritage wasn't happy with Pinnacle's recent performance. The stock had been essentially flat for 18 months while their competitors were growing steadily. Customer satisfaction scores were declining, employee turnover was increasing, and their technical infrastructure was showing signs of serious strain. "What exactly are you proposing, Mike?" "Nominate me for their board of directors. I know where all the operational problems are hidden, I understand their technical challenges better than anyone, and I can help turn the company around. Plus, my first order of business would be a comprehensive audit of their management practices and hiring decisions." Andrew smiled, but it wasn't entirely friendly. "You want revenge. I want justice," I corrected. "But if justice happens to involve some satisfying revenge, I can live with that outcome." The negotiation took 3 weeks of phone calls, emails, and one in-person meeting at Heritage's offices. Andrew had to convince his partners that nominating a disgruntled former employee wasn't just an expensive gesture. I had to prove that I could add real value to Pinnacle's board beyond my personal grievances against Brad. In the end, the numbers convinced them. Pinnacle's technical infrastructure was genuinely deteriorating, their customer metrics were trending downward, and their stock performance was lagging the sector by almost 15%. Heritage needed changes at the company, and I represented the most qualified candidate they could find who also had comprehensive inside knowledge of Pinnacle's operational problems. Heritage agreed to nominate me for Pinnacle's board of directors on a Friday afternoon in late April. The nomination had to be submitted exactly 90 days before the annual shareholders meeting, which gave me the entire summer to prepare what would essentially be a public prosecution of Brad Hoffman's leadership. Those 90 days became the most intense preparation period of my professional life. I treated it like building a case for trial, because in many ways, that's exactly what it was. Every morning I'd sit in my home office with coffee and legal pads, documenting every technical failure, security breach, and system outage that had occurred since my termination. And there were plenty. Tommy Hoffman was drowning in responsibilities he'd never been trained to handle. Jim Walsh became my inside source, though he was careful about what information he shared. During our occasional lunch meetings at a diner halfway between his office and my house, he'd update me on the growing chaos in Pinnacle's IT department. The email server crashed for 6 hours last week, Jim told me over coffee and pie one Tuesday afternoon. Tommy couldn't figure out how to restart the backup systems. We lost all outbound email functionality during business hours. What about the disaster recovery protocols I wrote? I asked. He couldn't find them. Apparently they were filed under your old directory structure, and nobody thought to preserve that when they wiped your access. Each story was another bullet point in my presentation, another piece of evidence that Pinnacle was systematically destroying its operational capabilities to save money. The cloud migration project I'd spent 18 months planning was stalled because Tommy didn't understand the security requirements. Customer databases were running on servers that should have been replaced 2 years ago. The backup systems were failing regularly, and nobody seemed to know how to fix them. Meanwhile, at home, Sarah was watching me transform from a defeated middle-aged job seeker into something more focused and determined. She'd find me at my desk at all hours, surrounded by printouts of SEC filings and corporate governance documents. "You're obsessed with this," she said one evening, standing behind my chair and reading over my shoulder. "I'm thorough," I replied. "There's a difference. Mike, what happens if you lose? What if the shareholders don't vote for you?" I turned to face her. "Then I'll have tried everything I could think of to make this right. But I'm not going to lose, Sarah. I know this company better than anyone in that room, including Brad." The annual shareholders meeting was scheduled for the third Thursday in August at a downtown hotel conference center. About 250 people showed up, mostly institutional investors, a handful of individual shareholders, and the usual collection of corporate lawyers and consultants. The meeting room had that generic hotel ballroom feel: beige carpet, fluorescent lighting, and round tables with cheap linens. Brad ran the meeting with his usual polished corporate presentation style. He stood behind a podium with the Pinnacle logo prominently displayed, clicking through PowerPoint slides about revenue growth, market expansion, and strategic initiatives. Everything looked impressive if you didn't know what to look for, which most of the shareholders didn't. "Pinnacle continues to execute on our cost optimization strategy," Brad announced, advancing to a slide showing reduced operational expenses. "We've streamlined our workforce while maintaining operational excellence." I almost laughed out loud. Operational excellence. The company's email system had crashed 3 times in the past month, and their customer support response times had doubled since I left. When Brad finished his presentation, Thomas Caldwell took the microphone to handle the formal business portion of the meeting. Board nominations were the third item on the agenda, right after the approval of last year's minutes and the auditor's report. "We have one contested board position this year," Caldwell announced. "Heritage Investment Partners has nominated Michael Reynolds as an alternative candidate to the management slate." When my name was called, I stood up from my table near the back of the room and walked to the front. The room was quiet. Most shareholders had no idea who I was or why I was there. Brad's face had gone completely white. He clearly hadn't expected to see me at the meeting, and definitely hadn't expected me to be nominated for his board. I'd practiced this presentation dozens of times in my home office, timing it to exactly 15 minutes. It was part technical analysis, part corporate governance lecture, and part character assassination. All delivered in the professional, measured tone I'd perfected over 2 decades of corporate presentations. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mike Reynolds. I spent 22 years at Pinnacle Technologies as their senior IT director, until I was terminated this past March under what management called restructuring. I clicked to my first slide, which showed Pinnacle's declining operational metrics over the past 18 months. Since my departure, Pinnacle's technical infrastructure has experienced a pattern of failures that threatens both customer satisfaction and data security. Email outages, database crashes, and backup system failures have become routine occurrences. I clicked through slides showing customer complaint trends, system downtime statistics, and employee turnover rates in technical positions. The numbers painted a clear picture of a company in operational decline. These problems stem directly from management decisions to prioritize short-term cost savings over operational competence. Experienced technical staff have been systematically replaced with junior employees who lack the institutional knowledge necessary to maintain complex systems. Then I dropped the bombshell about Brad's hiring practices. In my specific case, I was replaced by the CEO's nephew, a recent college graduate with no relevant experience, who was hired at approximately half my salary. This represents not just poor judgment, but potentially actionable age discrimination. The room stirred with murmurs and uncomfortable shifting. Thomas Caldwell was taking notes and looking increasingly stern. Several institutional investors were whispering to their colleagues. I continued for another 10 minutes, detailing specific technical failures, security vulnerabilities, and operational inefficiencies. Every claim was backed up with documentation that I'd carefully gathered and verified. When shareholders asked questions, I had detailed, specific answers that demonstrated comprehensive knowledge of the company's operations. "Mr. Reynolds," asked a woman from Vanguard, "what would your first priority be if elected to the board?" "A comprehensive operational audit conducted by independent consultants. Pinnacle's shareholders deserve to know the true state of the company's infrastructure and management practices." When the voting happened 2 hours later, I won the board seat by a margin of 62% to 38%. The institutional investors had clearly heard enough about Pinnacle's operational problems to want someone on the board who understood the technical side of the business. Brad tried to maintain his composure during the vote count, but I could see the panic in his eyes. He knew exactly what I knew about Pinnacle's problems, and he understood that I now had a platform to expose all of it. After the meeting, as shareholders filed out of the ballroom, Thomas Caldwell approached me near the registration table. "Mr. Reynolds, I think we need to have a conversation about the company's operational status. Can you attend an emergency board meeting next week?" "I'll be there," I said. "And Mr. Caldwell?" "I have quite a lot to discuss." That evening, Sarah and I celebrated at our favorite restaurant. Nothing fancy, just the Italian place where we'd had our first date 25 years ago. Over wine and pasta, I told her about the vote, about Brad's expression when the results were announced, about Caldwell's invitation to an emergency board meeting. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Like I just won the first round," I said, "but the real fight starts next week." The emergency board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 2 p.m. in Pinnacle's executive conference room, the same room where I'd been fired 5 months earlier. Walking back into that building felt surreal. The security guards who'd escorted me out in March now had to issue me a visitor's badge and direct me to the executive floor. I arrived 15 minutes early and set up my laptop at the polished mahogany table. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the Chicago skyline stretching toward Lake Michigan. This was where corporate decisions got made, where millions of dollars in shareholder value could be created or destroyed with a single vote. The other board members filed in right on schedule. Thomas Caldwell took his seat at the head of the table, flanked by the other directors, people I'd seen at company events but never actually worked with. Brad entered last, looking like he hadn't slept much since the shareholders' meeting. He avoided eye contact and sat at the opposite end of the table from me. "Gentlemen, we have some serious operational concerns to address," Caldwell began. "Mr. Reynolds, you made some significant claims at the shareholders' meeting. I think it's time we heard the details." I'd prepared for this moment for months. I opened my laptop and began the presentation that would systematically dismantle Brad's leadership. In the 5 months since my termination, Pinnacle has experienced 47 documented system failures, including 8 major outages that affected customer operations, I began, clicking to a slide that showed a timeline of technical disasters. The email infrastructure has crashed 6 times, requiring expensive emergency support from outside contractors. I walked them through each failure, explaining not just what had happened, but why it had happened and how much it was costing the company. The board members asked pointed questions about security vulnerabilities, data backup procedures, and customer impact. I had detailed answers for everything. "Mr. Hoffman," Caldwell said, turning to Brad, How do you respond to these operational concerns? Brad shifted uncomfortably in his chair. These are growing pains from our cost optimization initiatives. We're working to address any temporary issues. Temporary? I interrupted. Your nephew has been on the job for 5 months and still doesn't know how to restart the backup servers. Last week, Pinnacle lost 14 hours of customer data because the backup systems failed, and nobody knew the recovery procedures I'd documented. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. One of the board members, a woman named Catherine Wells from the audit committee, leaned forward with obvious concern. Mr. Hoffman, is it true that you hired a family member to replace Mr. Reynolds? Brad's face flushed red. Tommy is qualified for the position. He has a computer science degree from DePaul. With 0 professional experience, I added, and he's being paid $75,000 for a position that requires $145,000 worth of expertise and institutional knowledge. The questions continued for another hour. I presented documentation of age discrimination patterns, questionable financial practices, and systematic degradation of operational capabilities. By the end of the meeting, the board had voted unanimously to conduct a comprehensive operational audit by external consultants. They also voted to freeze all executive bonuses pending the audit results. The audit took 8 weeks and cost Pinnacle $180,000. The external consultants were thorough, professional, and absolutely devastating in their conclusions. They found everything I'd told the board they'd find, plus additional problems I hadn't even known about. Pinnacle's IT infrastructure was described as critically vulnerable with systematic failures in basic operational procedures. The security assessment was even worse. Customer data was at risk, backup systems were unreliable, and the company was potentially violating several compliance requirements. The Human Resources Review uncovered a clear pattern of age discrimination. Over 3 years, Brad had replaced 12 senior employees with younger, cheaper alternatives. 5 of those replacements had personal connections to Brad or other executives. The legal liability alone was estimated at several $1,000,000. But the technical assessment was the real killer. The consultants estimated it would take at least $4.7 million and 24 months to repair the damage that had accumulated since my departure. Customer satisfaction scores had dropped 31% in 6 months. 2 major clients had already terminated their contracts due to service reliability issues. When the audit results were presented to the board in October, Thomas Caldwell asked Brad for his response. "We can address these issues," Brad said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "It's just a matter of resources and timeline management." "Resources you don't have and time you've already wasted," I replied. "Mr. Chairman, I move that this board conduct a comprehensive review of executive leadership effectiveness with particular focus on the CEO position." The motion passed 6-1. Brad was the only dissenting vote. He resigned 2 weeks later. His resignation letter cited philosophical differences with the board's strategic direction, but everyone knew the real reason. His lawyers had probably told him that staying would mean facing a discrimination lawsuit with the board's full documentation of his hiring patterns. The board asked me to serve as interim chief technology officer while they searched for a new CEO. I accepted, with one condition. I wanted to personally review every questionable personnel decision made in the past 3 years. That review led to some satisfying discoveries. Tommy Hoffman had been falsifying his timesheets, billing 55 hours per week while actually working maybe 25. He'd also been using company credit cards for personal expenses, including a $3,400 gaming setup for his apartment. He was quietly terminated and required to repay $28,000 in fraudulent wages and expenses. 3 employees who'd been pushed out under questionable circumstances were offered their jobs back with full back pay and restored seniority. 2 accepted immediately. The third had found a better position elsewhere but sent a thank you note saying it meant everything to have his reputation cleared. The age discrimination lawsuit that 6 former employees had filed was settled out of court for $2.3 million. As part of the settlement, Pinnacle agreed to implement new hiring oversight procedures and provide bias training for all managers. 6 months after Brad's resignation, Pinnacle had a new CEO, Margaret Foster, a respected industry veteran who understood that technology companies succeed by investing in people and infrastructure, not by cutting corners to boost quarterly numbers. The stock price had recovered all of its losses and was trending upward. Customer satisfaction scores were back to previous levels, and employee morale was the highest it had been in years. As for me, I stayed on the board and accepted the permanent CTO position. My new salary was $165,000, plus equity compensation that could be worth serious money if the company continued to recover. More importantly, I had something that money can't buy: complete vindication. Every person in the Chicago tech industry who'd wondered why Mike Reynolds got fired from Pinnacle now knew the real story. My reputation wasn't just restored, it was enhanced. Other companies started reaching out about consulting opportunities and board positions. Brad Hoffman eventually found a new job at a small consulting firm in the suburbs, a significant step down from running a publicly traded company. Word travels fast in our industry, and the circumstances of his departure from Pinnacle became common knowledge pretty quickly. His career peak was behind him at 52. I still see him occasionally at industry events. He usually finds somewhere else to be when I'm around. That's fine with me. People sometimes ask if I feel bad about what happened to Brad. The honest answer is no. He made a choice to prioritize personal relationships over business ethics and operational excellence. He chose to discard loyal employees like they were disposable assets. When that choice caught up with him, he paid the price that decisions like that deserve. That's not revenge, that's accountability. There's a difference, and it matters. Brad Hoffman thought firing me would solve his problems. Instead, it created the biggest problem of his professional life. He gave me a cardboard box and 10 minutes to clear out my office. In return, I gave him a front row seat to the systematic destruction of everything he'd built. Some people might call that overkill. I call it justice with compound interest, and it was worth every minute of the 5 months it took to execute.